Hello, I welcome you all as our guests in our event of celebration of the Centenary of Phenomenological Psychopathology. 100 years ago, in this exact day, in Zurich, there was a symposium attended by figures like Ludwig Binswanger and Eugen Minkowski, where the first case studies on mental disorders from a phenomenological perspective set the founding stone of what is today known as phenomenological psychopathology. Today, the value based centered and the Brazilian Society of Phenomenal Structural Psychopathology bring us together to look on the tradition, advances, and challenges for the future of comprehensive psychopathology from some of the lead scientists of the field. But before we start, I'll tell you a short summary of what we're going to listen to. First, we're having the introduction to the centenary from the values based centered by our kind Professor Ashok Handa, the director of Values Based Century. In the following, we're having four presentations from our lead scientists whose lectures I can't wait to listen. Our first guest is Professor Guilherme Messas, whose lecture's title is 100 Years of Phenomenological Psychopathology, a Global View. Later, we'll have Giovanni Stanghellini, who will lecture us on the concepts, narratives, and images, followed by Professor Matthew Broome, who will speak on the meaning in phenomenological psychopathology, the case of psychosis and hallucination. And last but not least, Professor Luis Sass will bestow us on the subject of the heart of the matter on phenomenological psychopathology. I confess I'm excited to hear out of those lectures. And in the end, we'll have some time for Q&A. Now, we're starting our lectures. I'd like to invite Professor Ashok Handa, who's here with us. Professor Ashok is a consultant vascular surgeon at the John Radcliffe Hospital, Oxford, and the director for teaching in Nuffield Department of Surgical Sciences, Oxford University. He's the director of the Collaborating Center for Values-Based Practice and has led the development of the program for values-based surgical care. Ashok is a fellow and tutor for graduates at the St. Catherine's College of Oxford. Professor Ashok, I welcome you here with us, and it's an honor for having you. I give you the floor.
Fabio, thank you so much for this most kind introduction, not just to me, but also to this session and this historical day. I'm honored to be asked to have a short introduction to what I think are going to be an amazing set of four lectures. And in fact, I was recently, only 10 days ago, in Zurich, at the University of Zurich, where this all started 100 years ago. And some of you may or may not know that Bill Fulford, who was the founding director of the Collaborating Center, and also I'd like to count as a mentor and friend, was being honored by the University of Zurich Philosophical Society with a medal. And it seemed very fitting to be in Zurich literally days before this 100-year anniversary. So we in the Collaborating Center of Values-Based Practice are truly delighted to be able to co-host this with the Brazilian Society. And I'm really delighted to have an opportunity to do that. Now, coming from more of a physical health background as a surgeon, I think it's fair to say that the historical evolution of psychiatry and clinical psychology is very distinct from those of other medical specialties like my own in surgery and, in fact, physical health in general. And this is because while in the health of the body, there is this gradual technological advances, and that's been much faster in the last quarter of a century than the previous 3/4 of the last century. These technological advances make discoveries and techniques of the past sometimes obsolete. For example, there are many operations that we just don't do anymore because they've been superseded. The one that comes most to mind is for gastric ulcers, where in fact antibiotic and proton pump inhibitors have eradicated virtually the need for surgery. And so in those respects, those treatments become only of historical value. However, in the mental health field, the scenario is quite different. So here there are several paradigms, and each paradigm has its own historical development. And the history of mental health, in turn, is above all the conflict for this hegemony of paradigms. So, in a moment like now, where there's this clamor for a new paradigm in mental health, it is phenomenology that is called upon to inform this paradigm. And so, this centenary is really important to be able to look back and say, well, there's so much that has changed in the way we understand physical disease, and maybe not enough has changed in our study around mental health. So this celebration of the centenary is crucial, and I'm very grateful to the Brazilian Society for taking this initiative, both with this sessions today, and I know that there's some follow-up sessions tomorrow in Brazil, which will be not in the English language, but we're particularly pleased that Professors Broome, Professor Messas, Professor Stanghellini, and Professor Sass are going to give you much more nuanced talks, which will help us to celebrate the centenary, which I, as a non-expert coming mainly from physical health, feel inadequate to do so. So I'd want to conclude by congratulating the Brazilian Society on having this celebration, and my grateful thanks for involving the Collaborating Center in this very important session. And I hope that the recordings will be widely disseminated, and we will certainly facilitate that from the Collaborating Center. So I'd like to stop there and hand back to you, Fabio.
Thank you, Professor Ashok. Thank you for all your help, and Bill and Mihir's. What we're having today, we're having also because of you guys. Thank you a lot. Now, moving on, the presentations. We're having our guests. Now we're having as our guests some of the top scientists of the field of phenomenological psychopathology. First, I want to introduce you Professor Guilherme Messas. He is a PhD, private docent at Santa Casa de São Paulo School of Medical Sciences. He is the lead for values-based practice in Brazil. Also, he is a clinician in psychiatry, and in addition to his clinical work, he has been closely involved with policy on substance misuse at national and state levels. He had published many articles and books discussing phenomenological psychopathology, and for last, he was our first president of the Brazilian Society of Phenomenal Structural Psychopathology. Welcome, Professor Messas. I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Fabio. Can you all hear me? I think so. Yes, fine. Well, first of all, I like to thank you, all my friends from the phenomenological field, to join us in this celebration. I'd like to consider this meeting more as a celebration, more as a party than an academic field, though I will put forward some ideas. I am very glad to be here and also to see as my Brazilian society to which I belong, our Brazilian society, worked along with Values-Based Center in Oxford to put forward this event. This is a very lovely joint venture and very competent as well. Due to you, Fabio, also to Flavio, and on Oxford, and to me here. Thank you, Ashok, for chairing the session. And if I may, my friends Giovanni, Matthew, and Luis for participating in this meeting as well, enlightening and enriching this celebration. What I would like to present to you in the following, if I may, if I get to present my slides. No, of course. Yes. Can you see these slides?
Yes, we can.
Yes, you can. Yeah. Well,
it is a bit small, but I think it's work.
No, it's small because I didn't put it in presentation form. So now it's bigger, isn't it?
It's perfect.
So, well, as I mentioned, I'd like just to highlight some aspects of this centenary of phenomenological psychopathology to further discussion and to celebrate our partnership. Our in terms of my generation and the old generations and the new generation. So a congregation of generations, which I'd like to link by the ideas I will put forward now. So I will divide my presentation in three parts. Responding to three questions. What are we celebrating today? Why are we celebrating this? And what for are we celebrating these 100 years of phenomenological psychopathology? So first, what are we celebrating? Well, this is a very special day for all of us. As Ashok mentioned in his opening words, we're celebrating a small session on the 25th of November, 100 years ago, exactly 100 years ago, in which, in this Swiss Psychiatric Society session, two authors who afterwards happened to be the leaders of this movement or the intellectual founding fathers of this movement, two preliminary papers on that moment. They would happen to be the initial papers of a new movement, particularly on Ludwig Binswanger's paper on phenomenology. We can see the introduction of the notion of phenomenology in this sense we are celebrating and defending, so to speak, today. There's also this paper from, famous paper from Minkowski, which I also recommended to you. So we are celebrating phenomenological psychopathology, 100 years of that. But we need some history, some historical approach to make clear my point, our point of what phenomenological psychopathology, as it is sometimes misleading, this word, this umbrella word, phenomenological psychopathology. And I will point out the core of the debates. We can read in this 1912 paper from the young soul, then philosopher Karl Jaspers, originally in German, but published in 1968 in the British Journal of Psychiatry, called in English, The Phenomenological Approach in Psychopathology. So definitely, we must say that the introduction of the term, of the word phenomenology or phenomenological in psychiatry must be related to Karl Jaspers, though it was a philosophical term so far. But if you read with some attention the ulterior work of Karl Jaspers, his masterpiece, General Psychopathology, we can read at its introduction, and I will quote, that Jaspers mentioned that it is wrong to call this book the principal text of phenomenology. He states that though there is a chapter on phenomenological psychopathology, on phenomenology in the very beginning of your work, the whole book is directed to showing that this phenomenology is only one point of view among many, and holds a subordinated position at that. This is very important to understand, because for Karl Jaspers, phenomenology was a sort of introduction of this, of his perspective of methodological organization of methods in psychiatry. So he creates at that moment the idea of phenomenology as a sort of literally descriptive psychopathology, which must be honored, but is distinct from what happens from 1922 on. I'd like to defend here that from 22 on, the core notion of phenomenological psychopathology, rather than a description of the experiences or conscious experiences, was the notion of structure. That is, two perspectives. Beyond the description of experience, it is of interest of phenomenological psychopathology the description as well of the structures, the pre-reflective, or sometimes called implicit, or sometimes called transcendental structure of the very experience. And the second aspect of this notion, this new notion of structure, is the notion of whole. That is, each symptom, each particular experience should be understood from its dialectical perspective with the whole. I think that these two ideas, the pre-reflective dimension and the necessary relationship between parts and whole, though present in Jaspersian work, definitely was not put forward as radically as from this moment we celebrate now on. So, if we are celebrating this conception, we should ask ourselves why this deserves celebration. I will summarize one of my favorite citations that comes from Michel Foucault and The Order of Things, which, as far as I understand, summarizes perfectly this creation of human being as we saw in the 20th century. So the idea is that, I highlighted it in red, man, that is the science of human beings, human sciences, is an invention of recent date. It's an invention, it's not a natural type. It's a creation of culture, of categories of thought. And it was, in his opinion, nearing its end if the arrangements, the social and historical arrangements, were to disappear, sociologically disappear. And this conception of human being we are now celebrating would be erased, even erased, so says Foucault, like a face drawn in sand at the edge of the sea if the conditions disappear. So we are celebrating actually the diaspora of these people who created and keeping alive this creation of a perception of human being. We are celebrating also the diaspora of these people, all these generations and layers of thinkers and clinicians, which are spread around the world. And I can mention some journals who demonstrate this validity and the strength of this movement of human creation. For instance, the journal, I had the honor with some friends in Brazil to create some 10 years ago, specifically on contemporary phenomenological psychopathology, but also, like Giovanni Stanghellini knows well, the classical journal in Italian, mostly in Italian, Comprendere, but also in the US, the classical journal of phenomenological psychology, and many others. I think there's another one. Yes, I called the journal Le Cercle Herméneutique from the French researchers. All of them keeping alive and moving forward the idea of phenomenological psychopathology. But also we can see the strength of this movement in some more international and more open to new to dialoguing with other fields, like, for instance, the very important journal of Phenomenology and the Cognitive Sciences. I'd like to apologize for the many other journals around the world which I was not able to mention here. So what for are we celebrating phenomenological psychopathology? For the sake of what? So to mention again Foucault, what are the historical conditions today which require us to mention our tradition, to celebrate them? So we, as far as I understand, we are living in very interesting times in a good sense of the word. After some decades of an old paradigm who's starving now, there is very relevant call in such important scientific journals, like this is from Lancet, calling for shifting paradigms, looking for new paradigms which could account for the comprehensive need of mental health in society in terms of more efficacy and more reliability, validity in real terms for people who were living their experiences of altered experiences, but also enhancing the need for full respect for human rights. And we are celebrating phenomenological psychopathology because phenomenological psychopathology, as far as I understand, I believe my friends and the other presenters here believe as well, is appropriated. And more than this, time is ripe for a new wave of phenomenological psychopathology to respond for this new cause. Some challenges must be faced. And I would like to end my presentation just highlighting these challenges. One of them is how to present some ideas, how to renew phenomenological psychopathology and help the mental health as a whole to be enriched without phenomenological psychopathology, without a large program of qualifying, of training people to clinically act as phenomenological psychopathologists, be they psychiatrists, be they psychologists, be they nurse or whatever other mental health professional perspectives. One of our initiatives, along with Values-Based Center, is this International Meta-Masters program, a program who has been launched 1 year and a half ago and tries to initially bring together researchers, philosophers, clinicians in phenomenological psychopathology, and also in analytic philosophy tradition, to meet students from all over the world to gradually prepare this new generation of people trained for offering this layer of phenomenological psychopathology to psychiatry as a whole. And last but not least, as Professor Matthew Broome will maybe mention, and Professor Giovanni Stanghellini also, both are the leaders of this movement. I'd like just to mention the idea of this new initiative called Renewing Phenomenological Psychopathology, who definitely is a breakthrough, pointing out the new times of phenomenological psychopathology in the 21st century. Well, to conclude, I'd like to say to all of you, my friends, folks in general, that definitely phenomenological psychopathology is very welcome and appropriated for the recent definition of mental health, but more important, more crucial than that, for defining what is a human being, what is living as a human person. So I conclude saying, toasting long life to the phenomenological psychopathology and all of us phenomenological people. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Messas. It is always inspiring to hear your lectures and to attend your classes. I myself am a student at the MetaMasters, and the experience has been amazing. Well, and the following, as our second speaker, I'll present to you Professor Giovanni Stanghellini. He's a medical doctor and a doctor honoris causa. He's a full professor of dynamic psychology at the Department of Health Science in the University of Florence. He is the leading editor of the Oxford Handbook of Phenomenological Psychopathology and co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Philosophy and Psychiatry. He has published more than 200 papers in the field of clinical phenomenology, and among his authored books, I'd like to mention Disembodied Spirits and the Animated Bodies, the Psychopathology of Common Sense, and Lost in Dialogue, Anthropology, Psychopathology, and Care. Professor Giovanni, it's nice to have you here with us. I give you the audience.
Thank you for this invitation. Thank you, Fabio, for this generous introduction. Guilherme showed the roots of clinical phenomenology, and we must be very grateful for that. Well, I will try to sketch what might be its future, especially if you are open to other languages. As mentioned by Guilherme, Matthew and I are running a project called Renewing Phenomenological Psychopathology, and my talk today is part of this project. Okay, there are two basic ways to discovery at play in psychopathology. I will call the first one ticking boxes, and the second drafting arrows. In ticking boxes, the main epistemological tenet is that psychopathological disorders manifest themselves in characteristic sets of symptoms that are in principle accessible to question and answer techniques. The clinician's main goal is discovering whether a patient meets pre-given diagnostic criteria. The aim of ticking boxes is neither an in-depth understanding of the patient's personal experiences, nor revealing previously unknown features of the patient's condition, but assessing those phenomena that are a priori deemed important as diagnostic indexes, leading to the classification of the patient according to predefined diagnostic categories. Diagnostic categories are often established in a politically driven manner rather than as a logical and scientific progression via cooperative agreement and negotiations between experts, rather than according to the validity of nosographical categories, that is, on the basis of correspondence to external reality. The process of diagnosis in the clinic is compared to two people assembling a puzzle, where the patient has the pieces and the interviewer the image of the completed design. The interviewer's main goal is discovering whether a patient with a given set of symptoms, the single pieces of the puzzle, meets criteria, the image of the completed design. Ticking boxes seems to liken the clinician's task to that of an accountant, counting symptoms, and accountabilism can be considered its epistemological hallmark. Actually, to a close look, ticking boxes does not imply discovery at all, if by discovery we mean the process of citing the existence of something for the first time. It has no heuristic power and ends up to be a mere tautology. A person with symptoms of depression is affected by a syndrome called depression. A second way to discovery is drafting arrows. That means constructing causal diagrams, directed graphs that display linear causal relationships between variables or nodes connected by an arrow to other nodes. Causal diagrams are explanatory narratives, including psychodynamic and biological ones. In psychodynamic explanatory diagrams, the aim is achieving meaningfulness via the logic of motivational causation. A given symptom is the consequence of a given mind state, usually an unconscious motivation, which typically involuntarily produces it. It is essential for a psychodynamic narrative to connect via an arrow a deeper mind state to a more surface or epiphenomenal one. Explanatory biological diagrams exploit the same logic, but in the place of psychological motivation, the cause to be linked by an arrow to a given surface symptoms is a deep biological anomaly. These forms of discovery based on linear causality and linear temporality have given great strength to psychopathological knowledge, but are not immune from limitations. They obviously imply some kind of reductionism of the complexities of human subjectivity. And although sweeping reductionism, a sort of theory of everything, seems to have disappeared from the scene, another no less problematic form of reductionism seems to be rampant. The second kind is creeping reductionism, which involves partial reductions that work on a patch of science where bit by bit we get fragmentary explanations using disparate interlevel mechanisms, including neurotransmitters, genes, neural circuits, etc. Creeping reductionism seems to tolerate a kind of pragmatic and pluralistic parallelism. How objective are the narratives construed through drafting errors? And how objective are the techniques devised to obtain reliable diagnosis through ticking boxes? Recognizing the value of objectivity in psychopathology and being faithful to it as much as possible is valuable, but being spellbound to the sirens of objectivity makes one lose sight of the very nature of the mental phenomena, which is relational and emergent. Although there is no single and neatly concept of emergence independent of particularly explanatory context, an emergent phenomenon can be roughly defined as a phenomenon that is irreducibly relational. Emergent features are not reducible to any intrinsic property of any element of a whole. Emergentism seems to be a corrective which counteracts the limitations of accountabilism, reductionism, and objectivism. Emergence occurs in the first place when an entity is observed to have properties that its parts separately do not have, properties that emerge only when the parts interact on a wider whole. An emergent phenomenon is a phenomenon that does not exist in itself, but needs an observer to take place. It emerges thanks to the interaction between something out there and the mind of an observer. Should we not give up some of our claims to reliability, linear causality, and objectivity? Should we not give up some of our claims to reliability, linear causality, and objectivity, and admit that discovery in psychopathology necessarily produces emergent knowledge? I will sketch an argument to support an alternative way to knowledge and discovery based on the emergent properties of psychopathological phenomena. I will call this approach linking dots. The dots at issue here are basically fragments of lived experience provided by the patients themselves as pieces of their personal history, experience situations, emotions, beliefs, imagination, dreams, etc. Or fragments of lived experience arising in the intersubjective space in between the patient and the clinician during the clinical encounter. I will refer to these fragments of lived experience or singular phenomena with the term images. The reason for choosing this word is that these images should be thought of as pictures to be hanged on a wall, ideally posited in front of the patient and of the clinician, and patiently collected before the links between them arise spontaneously or semi-spontaneously in the patient's and in the clinician's minds. I will develop the approach to images and discovery devised by art historian Aby Warburg in his Atlas of Images, Bilder Atlas Mnemosyne. Created in the late 20s, its final version, published in October 1929, consisted of 63 wooden panels covered with black cloth on which were pinned about 1,000 pictures from books, magazines, newspapers, and other daily life resources. This collection of images reminds of a very similar project started in the same period by German Jewish philosopher, cultural and literary critic Walter Benjamin, called Passagenwerk, translated into English, Arcades Project, an enormous collection of quotes from heterogeneous sources, as those used by Warburg, illustrating the city life of Paris in the mid-19th century. Let us briefly present the basic steps in Warburg's method and begin to establish a parallel with linking dots in clinical practice. The first step consists of the establishment of an archive or collection of images gathered during the process of discovery in the clinical context, the psychopathological interview. A network of resonating images thus emerges. We may call this figura. A figura is a web of images reverberating with each other that is established thanks to linking dots between the individual images. Within a figura, each image constitutes a nucleus for the discernment of other images that relate to it. First, each image of the archive resonates with the others. Second, the images resonate with the observer's gaze. And then building on such a semi-spontaneous formed network of images, the further steps consist of an active montage of resonant images. The images are not mounted on the basis of inductive or deductive operations, but by their exemplary or paradigmatic characteristics. The juxtapositions are not even based on a diachronic temporal logic, but the elements of this archive are collected without regard to the linear model of temporality. The connection between such images is analogical, that is based on similarity, on family resemblances. And analogy is suspended within an emotional logic and the formal logic, as in the intention between these. The figurative links semi-spontaneously emerged via resonance and actively established via montage, uncover what in Walter Benjamin's words we may call their optical unconscious. These are steps of this process, but the process itself is never completed. These networks of images form an open construction, not a closed one like a diagnostic category or like the teleology of certain narratives. They provide a space for thought. This network constitutes a space for discovery, for the birth of a new thought. This practice could be taken as an exemplary method of discovery to be applied in the field of psychopathology, where the phenomena at issue are pathic and relational in nature. I suggest that Warburg's is an illustration of linking dots, an alternative or an integrative method to other methods like ticking boxes and drafting errors. And the concluding of my talk, I would like to summarize the epistemological principles of this way to discovery. First, linking dots proposes to shift attention from symptoms conceived as objective facts out there, conceptually described, to non-schematized affective qualities arising in a relational space condensed in images. Second, it also recommends to move away from computational narrative connections between phenomena to analogical figurative links between them within a network of analogies constituting a space for discovery. Third, and last but not least, it advises to focus, rather than on linear causality, on circular relationships and on the emergence of figurative causes generated by the interaction between the parts of a whole and between these parts and the observer. Whereas in the logic of ticking boxes, the particular, that is the symptom, represents a regularity by identifying which the patient's individual case can be traced back to a general diagnostic category. In the logic of linking dots, the particular, a fragment of lived experience, a single image, does not have its own intrinsic meaning, for instance, as a diagnostic index that refers to the general, but instead represents an exception, a singularity that arouses perplexity and disrupts the previously acquired representation of the patient's condition to the point of threatening the stability of the diagnostic categories. The objective of gathering images in the logic of linking dots is not to decipher a hieroglyphic, but to produce a hieroglyphic, a thought-provoking hieroglyphic. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Giovanni. It was also very inspiring, a very interesting topic. I hope I can hear more from this work. I was a bit caught on this thought. I'm coming back. Oh, well, now, as our third speaker, I'll introduce you Matthew Broome. He's a medical doctor and has 2 PhDs, one in psychiatry and the other in philosophy. He is chair in psychiatry and youth mental health, and he is the director of the Institute for Mental Health at the University of Birmingham. Also, he is Distinguished Research Fellow at Oxford Uehiro Centre for Practical Ethics in the University of Oxford and visiting professor at University of Naples. He's the director of the International Perspectives in Philosophy and Psychiatry and deputy editor of the British Journal of Psychiatry. He co-edited The Risk Factors for Psychosis, Paradigms, Mechanisms, and Prevention, the Oxford Handbook of Phenomenological Psychopathology, the Maudsley Reader in Phenomenological Psychiatry, and Psychiatry as Cognitive Neuroscience, Philosophical Perspectives. Professor Matthew, I welcome you to join us. I give you the floor.
Many thanks, Fabio, and thank you to you and our colleagues in the Brazil Society and St. Catherine's for hosting this wonderful event today. It's a great privilege to be here with friends and colleagues on the centenary of the meeting of Minkowski and Binswanger in Zurich. So a great privilege to be here, so thank you. I will try and share the slides if this works. Is that come up, Fabio? Is that okay?
It is okay. I can see them.
Good. So yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to talk today. And I'll try and speak for around 20 minutes or so. And what I'll try and talk about is the concept of meaning in phenomenological psychopathology, in particular in reference to hallucinations and psychosis. And Guilherme and Giovanni very kindly mentioned our joint wellcome funding project on psychopathology. So I'll kind of reference that, some kind of new ways we're thinking about some of this work in Birmingham currently. So thank you very much. So what I'll do is start off with a little bit of history, really. Sadly, I won't mention Binswanger, but we'll mention Minkowski and talk about psychopathology as the exploration of meaning, with reference to the work of Jaspers, Dilthey, Minkowski, and the Scottish psychiatrist R.D. Laing. Then I'll briefly summarise some data with colleagues on the phenomenon of auditory verbal hallucinations and how that experience is linked to meaning making. I will touch on some work with our colleague Clara Humpston on the relationship between hallucinations and thought insertion, and close with some comments about some ongoing work where we link up our interest in phenomenology with some work around epistemic injustice and epistemic agency in youth mental health. So to start, I'll refer back to an editorial Giovanni and I wrote several years ago for the British Journal of Psychiatry, where we offered psychopathology as the basic science of psychiatry. This is a professional journal in the UK, so we wanted to stress the importance of learning psychopathology for our trainees and our clinical colleagues. So in this paper, Giovanni and I suggested that psychopathology was a discipline that did provide clinicians with the basic knowledge of the abnormal phenomena that affect the human mind and a valid and reliable method to appraise them. However, as Giovanni has said at his last talk, it's not just that. It's not just nosography or listing of symptoms. It's also person-orientated and not just illness-orientated. And hence, psychopathology can see symptoms as a source of distress to be helped, as in the rest of medicine and clinical practice, but also as an area of personal meaning to be explored. And in this editorial, Giovanni and I argued that this more biomedical and this more meaning-orientated approach should work in parallel in our clinical work and should be an encouragement to developing a strong therapeutic relationship and partnership. Of course, as Guilherme in his lovely talk gave us, we're very lucky benefactors of previous work by our esteemed colleagues in the past, not least Carl Jaspers. And Jaspers gives us some tools to do psychopathology, and indeed I'm going to reference the same paper that Guilherme referenced, the phenomenological approach in psychopathology, which I read as a psychiatric trainee a long time ago, and it's published in the British Journal of Psychiatry, and again we published it in our Maudsley Reader. So Jaspers tells us there are three techniques he decides to use to study psychopathology. One is observation, so watching and looking and seeing what the person is doing. The second is empathy. And the third is description and demarcation. And as we know, he takes over ideas from Brentano and the early Husserl and applies them to psychopathology. But for his empathy, Jaspers turns to the hermeneutics, the philosophy of social science, and the work of Wilhelm Dilthey, and the idea of Weerstehen or interpretive understanding. And the quote is here that thoughts and emotions You can understand and interpret thoughts and emotions from the inside by putting oneself in their shoes and reliving their experiences. And as we know, Jaspers argues very powerfully in the general psychopathology about how understanding should work in parallel with this causal understanding as well. So empathetic understanding and causal understanding work in parallel. He does get misunderstood, and one of the things that many colleagues sometimes get a bit confused about is Jaspers' comments on schizophrenia and his idea that certain experiences, for example, primary delusions, are ununderstandable. But of course, Jaspers doesn't mean we shouldn't try to understand these things or think about alternate tools. All he's saying here is that one tool, that of empathy, perhaps will struggle to understand how these particular experiences arise from one another. So as I put there on the slide, so when Jaspers says ununderstandable, he means that these experiences resist attempts by another to understand them genetically. And when he says genetically, he doesn't mean it as we understand it genetically in terms of genes and the encoding of proteins, but rather how meaningful connections form over time using the technique of hermeneutics. But however, although it can't be used to understand how these things arise, this use of empathy can be a very important tool to demarcate and delineate certain experiences. And again, when we perhaps return to the principles of natural science to understand these experiences when empathy fails. And a couple of quotes again from Jaspers here to explain what he means by this empathy and psychological understanding. We sink ourselves into the psychic situation and understand genetically by empathy how one event emerges from another. Understanding the emergence of psychic events from each other has also been termed psychological explanation. In the natural sciences, we find causal connections only, but in psychology, our bent for knowledge is satisfied with a comprehension of quite different sorts of connections. Psychic events emerge out of one another in a way which we understand. Attacked people become angry and spring to defense. Cheated persons grow suspicious. The way in which such an emergence takes place is understood by us. Our understanding is genetic. So what you might call folk psychology nowadays, how we understand another person's mental state and how those things arise from one another. Of course, Jaspers was one of many classical phenomenologists we owe a huge debt to, and of course, the event today is in honour of a further one of those, namely Minkowski. Minkowski took some of these ideas further, and he emphasised the importance of relating to a person as a living personality, as a whole psychic reality, and trying to grasp experiences coherently, holistically, as a whole, the power of empathy, and indeed criticised Jaspers for thinking about things in too much of a symptom-focused, atomistic way, so seeing things as discrete areas of psychopathology rather than being a unified whole that reflects the whole person. And indeed came up with the idea of the generating or generative disorder, where he argues, and again this links back to Guilherme's talk about structure and transcendental structures, to seize the underlying structure of symptoms, think about deep and central factors that constitute the essence of disorder, which he refers to as the generative disorder. So he goes on to say that rather than thinking of a mental syndrome as a simple association of symptoms, a listing, a tick box in maybe Giovanni's way of talking about it, it's the expression of a profound and characteristic modification of the whole human personality. Indeed, another psychiatrist and phenomenologist I think highly of is R.D. Laing, and his incredible book, The Divided Self. And again, R.D. Laing argues against the psychiatry of his day, that we should have a science of the personal as much as a science of the impersonal, and criticises reductive biomedical psychiatry, and argues we need to have an existential appreciation of persons and how they find themselves in the world. And in the quote there, he says we have to orientate ourselves to the person in a scheme of things, rather than only see the other as an object in one's own world. So very much an existential, meaning-laden appreciation of the other. And the philosopher Matthew Ratcliffe and I wrote a paper for the Cambridge Companion of Existentialism on Laing and Sartre and understanding of psychopathology. So that's a little bit of history to start. I'm going to talk a bit about some more recent empirical work actually on hallucinations with colleagues in Birmingham and elsewhere nationally. So this is a study looking at auditory verbal hallucinations in young people with psychosis with my colleague Rachel Upthegrove, Femi Oyebode, who colleagues here may know as the editor of Symptoms in the Mind, so very skilled and highly respected psychopathologist in his own right, and Stephen Wood. This is work looking at trying to get some detailed descriptions of auditory verbal hallucinations in young people suffering those. And you can see there from the way we coded the rich experience of these people that various key things came out. The first is that the voices weren't just voices; they were of a definite entity, some kind of person or creature in the world, and also those voices, excuse me, were able to inflict control or power over the person who experienced them. And for somebody who obviously has interviewed many hundreds of people with hallucinations and psychosis, some of this information was new, and I guess reinvigorated my awareness that phenomenology can provide new knowledge. It's not a sort of dusty textbook of facts. It's telling us new things about people's experiences is really important. So as I say, the notion of entity and the notion of control and disruption and power and manipulation were very key to this experience that the patients reported to us. So some of these summaries of findings, as I say, utter realness, multiple voices, complex verbal interactions, this sense of lack of control, authority, and disruption. So when people were trying to get on with their lives, go shopping, pick up the kids from school, the voices would disturb them. The location was varied, externally, internally, into their head, mixed locations, often changing around their body. But very much so this idea of control, manipulating emotions, manipulating behavior, trying to make the patient feel guilty, trying to change their emotions, and very complex social interactions with the idea that the voice itself had a goal, an intentionality that was being imposed on the individual. And as I've said, trying to manipulate emotions by mocking, tricking, blaming, and manipulating. And although we teach our medical students and our trainees that a hallucination is a normal perception without an object, it's almost not. It's almost like a hyperreal perception, because one can't turn one's head away from the sound, you can't walk away from the noise, you can't cover your ears. These voices still persist. So we saw in this paper this greater passivity of the person than in normal perception. And I guess the other thing that came out quite strikingly, the auditory phenomenon didn't occur in isolation. It was very often accompanied by a physical or tactile sensation, namely a pain, an itching, or a pressure, or even sometimes a sort of thermic sensation, a change in the skin temperature when it was happening. So a very complex, rich experience with a deep social entity behind it. We carried on some of this work with another trainee psychiatrist, Peter, looking at how young people then seek to understand these experiences and manage them. And again, in this work, again with Femi and Rachel and colleagues, you can see some of the themes that came out from these interviews. Young people related to the voices in terms of searching for answers and forming their identities, how they coped with the voices, and also how being a voice hearer related more widely to their overall outlook on life. And I'll just bring out a few quotes here for colleagues. So you can see here from the first person who's trying to find searching for answers. For a big part of time, I was like looking on the internet for healers or spiritual healers, or trying to understand etheric and trying to understand what's happened to me. So there's a part of this experience of what's going on leads you to try and investigate. So a powerful source to try and find meaning here, but also an attempt to connect the voices with prior autobiography and prior events. So you can see in the second screenshot there, I think it's because my ex, before we split up, she got pregnant and she had an abortion. And ever since that, I've been hearing a baby cry. And the third screenshot, you can see, something I ask patients when I see them, so why do you think this is happening to you? And you can see here in the quotes, I tried to understand why it had chosen me to talk to, because there's like 7 billion people out there. So bafflement, why is this strange experience happening to me? You think they must be here for a reason, because why me? I'm not being funny, but why not you? So this awareness of searching for meaning, finding out what's going on and happening. And I want to sort of take forward from that how we began connecting this work in phenomenology and trying to understand the experiences of young people with psychosis to another area of philosophy, namely epistemic injustice. So this is the work of our colleague Miranda Fricker, which came out of feminist philosophy. And the idea simply is that we all, epistemic injustice essentially is one where one's status as a knower or as a person able to give knowledge to others is devalued. And the classic example would be maybe a woman, a person of colour, etc., has epistemic injustice done to them because we discount their ability to know. And conversely, as you can see on the slide there, epistemic agency is the capacity to produce and share knowledge competently and authoritatively. So one of our kind of ideas of our wider work in the philosophy of psychiatry is that perhaps young people with unusual experiences, such as those in the empirical papers I just summarized, may be at particularly high risk of epistemic injustice for several reasons. They're young people, so they have an identity that's fluid and developing. They may be in a power relationship with adults. There may be wider demographic differences. So I'm sure, as in colleagues internationally, people with mental health problems tend to be from more deprived and victimized backgrounds, more poverty, etc. And also there is a wide-standing view in society that if you might be irrational in one area, so for example, you might have a mental health problem, you're irrational in other areas. People assume that those kind of cross-pollinate, as it were, and your views are discounted more widely. So one of the things we've tried to do is sort of think about how we can train clinicians to acknowledge these interests and needs of people, listen genuinely, and develop a sense of mutual trust, sense of self, and support autobiographical narratives. And you can see a quote here from our colleague Rose McCabe, who's a professor at City University in London, where she did some detailed analysis of conversations between clinicians and those with psychosis. And Rose writes, patients with psychotic symptoms clearly attempted to discuss their psychotic symptoms and actively sought information during the consultation about the nature of these experiences and their illnesses. When patients attempted to present their psychotic symptoms as a topic of conversation, the doctors hesitated and avoided answering their patients' questions, indicating reluctance to engage with these concerns. I guess this might sound a bit weird to an audience like this. We're all very interested in phenomenology and psychopathology, but there are a group of clinicians who find these detailed discussions quite difficult, awkward, don't have the skills to engage with, and patients feel that silencing, that lack of epistemic justice, and feel they're not able to talk about it. So I think it's a really important thing to take forward. This is another study from a colleague, Olivia, who's a trainee clinical psychologist, well, now qualified clinical psychologist at the University of Bath. And Olivia and I met because she's very interested in this connection between voice hearing and epistemic injustice. And she did some fantastic work looking at clinical voice hearers and those who hadn't come into contact with clinical services and who instead found a kind of a peer support network of some kind, typically a spiritual one, so a kind of faith group they were able to work with and live alongside. And in Olivia's work, she demonstrated that both groups, the clinical and the non-clinical group, did experience this sense of epistemic injustice, where they themselves as knowers were discounted. It was more marked in the clinical group. Those who did find a group of supportive peers found this helped their sense making and reduced their distress. There's some evidence, obviously, that this was more helpful and beneficial for that. And in the right of the slide there, you can see the various themes that Olivia pulled out of her interviews, namely shifting identity, shifting relationships, and shifting power and position. So those in the more clinical setting found they were reduced in their epistemic abilities and reduced to being a label, whereas those who were in a more peer supportive group found they were more than they were before. The experience enhanced their status and identity of voice hearing. Those in a clinical group found they were yearning to be normal. Those in a supportive peer group felt they're protected and treasured in a loving and safe environment. However, it wasn't all good for those in the peer support group. You see that in the last dimension, the bottom, of shifting power and position. Those in the clinical group felt they're at the bottom of a social ladder. Their hopes and opportunities were limited. Those in the peer support spiritual settings, they kind of valued it, but also aware of the precarity of it. They were, incredibly insightful. Actually, they were aware they were almost given too much spiritual knowledge and power, and they themselves worried they weren't worthy of that. It wasn't quite honest or authentic. So they were kind of aware of the instability of it. And I guess they were also quite aware they stepped outside that relatively small boundary of a particular church or faith group. They similarly be treated very differently. So they were kind of aware of the kind of precarity and the isolation they still suffered. So the other area of work I want to touch on is work with Clara Humpston. So Clara is now a lecturer at the University of York, and Clara and I have worked together for several years. And one of the areas, the two sort of areas Clara and I have been interested in is, I guess, a bit going back to Minkowski again, trying to not see symptoms as discrete and atomistic, but trying to mess things up a bit, seeing how things are dynamic and move between various simple descriptions. So we've tried to look at relationship between voice hearing and thought insertion, and also how the phenomenological approach can relate to computational and predictive coding models of psychiatry. So one of the thoughts here is from Clara's work is how we can think of auditory verbal hallucinations and thought insertion as being related on two continua. one being the criteria, the continua of audibility. So you can see on that slide there, on the left and the right, the dimensions of audible and silent. And the second is one of sort of spatialness in relation to one's own mind and brain, one of internal and external. So you can see a true auditory verbal hallucination is in the bottom right, which is obviously audible and external typically. As you can see, our own thoughts tend to be silent and internal. If you think about movements along those two axes, you can see how different areas of psychopathology might be able to be described, namely thought insertion, thought echo, and as well as normal phenomena such as inner speech. So one of our things we're very interested in is to sort of take seriously the idea that belief and perception are interconnected, that psychopathology is dynamic and fluid, that experiences can morph into one another over time. And that we need to think, as with Minkowski, who we honour today, is experiences are a holistic whole rather than seen as an isolated and atomistic mental event. And indeed, as I say, Clara and I have also worked trying to think about connecting computational psychiatry and the work of obviously Louis and Giovanni, Joseph and others on the self-disturbance model of schizophrenia, trying to think how we can relate to these very detailed, important phenomenological accounts as to what computational psychiatry is telling us about symptom formation and production. So last few minutes, I hope I've got a few more minutes, Fabio, if that's okay, is talk a bit more widely about the Epistemic Injustice project. This slightly moves away from psychosis more specifically into more general mental health for young people. So very proud of this project. I guess it's a nice example. Very kindly, Guilherme and Giovanni mentioned our Wellcome-funded Renewing Phenomenological Psychopathology project. And this kind of predates this, but it kind of shows how interdisciplinary some of this work can be. So this is our kind of research team. You can see Lisa Bortolotti, who colleagues might know as a philosopher of psychiatry, also Rose McCabe, whose work I've already mentioned as a communication analyst of healthcare encounters, particularly psychiatry encounters. Michael Larkin, who's an expert on interpretive phenomenological analysis and qualitative techniques. Also Clara, sociologist. Rachel, a colleague with lived experience who leads the youth advisory group for McPin, which is a sort of charity who really champions lived experience research in the UK. So a really lovely, diverse, dynamic team to work with on this. And what we were doing, this was funded by the Medical Research Council, we had a series of consultations that Rose and her team had recorded of young people going to accident and emergency departments, so sort of casualty, acute hospitals in Britain asking for mental health care. And we were able to watch those consultations and with young people with lived experience and with this team and try and see what was happening there. I guess I should stress that most of those consultations were with mental health nurses rather than psychiatrists, but a variety of clinical professions. And what a lot of things came out was how epistemic injustice was manifested in those meetings and how young people were treated. And it was quite disturbing as a clinician myself. I was kind of quite shocked at what I saw sometimes when I was reviewing these consultations. But you can see the kind of things that young people felt was lacking and what could help. So namely, they felt they were excluded from decision making and that this needed to improve. So they suggested time needs to be taken to explain what was recommended, for example, be transparent about potential problems, ask about my concerns about treatment. Importantly, validate my experience. And yeah, young people are very insightful. So much like I guess with international colleagues, there is obviously a resource issue. There's not enough clinicians or time ever. But even just saying, I can see you're struggling can make a huge difference. Don't downplay the context, or don't downplay or contest what I'm feeling. So again, it was almost like a kind of quasi-legal consultation sometimes where you'd see the clinician to say, well, you can't really be suicidal. You look fine now, or you went out with your friends last night. How can you be having those thoughts now? So quite often trying to undercut and undermine the person's experience and self-report. Just because I look okay doesn't mean I am feeling okay. Affirming the capacity to change. So recognizing previous improvements and changes and how that might lead into the future, and avoid objectification. And young people have, complex views about diagnosis like we probably have as clinicians. They could see it as useful, as validating, as a mean to access treatment, but also wary about things being diagnosed too quickly or too prematurely. So we're at the stage now of kind of synthesizing some of this information on consultations and linking back the young person's experience, the young person's phenomenology of the consultation with these ideas of epistemic injustice, and how we can really help clinicians to make those consultations more just and to acknowledge the person's experience more. This is a paper that Lisa wrote with us for the Journal of Theory and Psychology, where we've tried to develop a kind of clinical ladder, and this might be of interest to Ashok, obviously trains a lot of clinicians, and how we can help clinicians move up the ladder to greater epistemic justice towards young people. And you can see the lower levels is validation of experience, then legitimization of help-seeking behavior, to more high-level things such as avoiding the objectification and premature labeling, affirming the capacity to contribute to change, and involvement and decision-making. And we are very fortunate to have another MRC award to sort of take this work forward now into the new year. So I'll conclude with a few last thoughts here. So I work a lot, as well as with the colleagues mentioned, with Rosa Ritonani, who's a PhD student with us in Birmingham. I published a few things in World Psychiatry, in the Lancet Psychiatry, about how to take phenomenology forward and how to connect some of these philosophical ideas with empirical work. And I guess one of Rosa's own real interest is how we can think about meaning in early psychosis. So a few things from that really is that, as I've mentioned, we tend to see psychopathology as dynamic. And because of that, see people as in some way self-constituting, self-interpreting. So symptoms aren't static. They themselves can modify it, but how they understand themselves, how they understand others, and how they understand the world. So we suggest there's an interplay between the person, their experience, and wider societal narratives. And you saw some of that in the quotes I showed you, where people look on the internet what's going on, or they try and find an explanation themselves. But there is general. I mean, Conrad broadly was right. Not the clinical accounts we read and understand. Outside of psychosis, generally, there's this kind of move from perplexity, unreality, threat, and disorientation, where meaning is made and created and fused. And young people or patients generally will find a coherence, a purpose, and a new way of engaging in the world with their psychopathology. We also suggest that meaning making is not neutral. It's not just a sort of added extra. As that early editorial that Giovanni and I wrote, it's really causally important understanding the diagnosis, the relationship, and thinking about the outcome therapeutically. The one thing I haven't got a thought on, but something that always occurs to me, is what do we do as clinicians? What is our ethical and professional account? If a patient says to us, what is the meaning of this, or is this due to a certain religious or cultural phenomenon, how we encourage that? Should we offer more positive meaning-making resources alongside the ones we have of biomedicine? So as well as saying dopamine and hypersalience, we offer some other account. And Guillaume and Giovanni very kindly mentioned our Wellcome-funded Renewing Phenomenological Psychopathology award, which is underway now. It's a 2-year award from the Wellcome Trust. So I think, again, shows that funders and scientific journals now really value the work we're doing in this kind of area. I think it's a really exciting time for us all. And this grant, as Giovanni said, is really looking to the future and trying to involve new disciplines. So these interactions, which I kind of gave examples of with sociology, with areas of philosophy, with different methods of qualitative research to enrich our field and our method, but also to bring in new areas of scholarship. So we're particularly keen to connect with areas outside of North America and Europe to include scholars more internationally, and those, of course, with lived experience. So I will close there, and thank you very much for your time and attention. Thank you, Fabio.
Thank you, Professor Matthew. It was very interesting. I'll have to look it back and take some notes. I really love the talk, all the talk.
Thank you, Fabio.
And now, as the last lecture of our celebration, I'll introduce you Professor Luis Sass. He's a distinguished professor in the Department of Clinical Psychology of the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology. Sorry, I'm so sorry. I'm a bit nervous. I'll start again. And now, as the last lecture of our celebration, I'll introduce you Professor Luis Sass. He's this distinguished professor in the Department of Clinical Psychology of the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology at Rutgers University, where he is also affiliated with the Comparative Literature Program in the Center for Cognitive Science. Sass has published extensively on schizophrenia, phenomenological psychopathology, psychoanalysis, hermeneutics, and the thought of Wittgenstein, Heidegger, and Foucault, as well as on modernism, postmodernism, and other cultural issues. He is the author of Madness and Modernism, Insanity in the Light of Modern Art, Literature and Thought, and the Paradox of Delusions, Wittgenstein, Schreber, and the Schizophrenic Mind. He has also extensive curriculum as a visiting professor at many universities, such as like the University of Chicago, Paris, Oviedo in Spain, Colombia, and Mexico. I welcome you, Professor Luis Sass. I'm sorry for my mistake, and I give you the floor.
Thank you, Fabio, and thank you for the organizers of this wonderful event. It's an honor to be speaking here, and it's an honor to be able to honor our eminent predecessors in philosophy and the mental health sciences and professions. It's also a pleasure to be here, if only virtually, with friends from the UK, from Brazil, from Italy, and from many other countries, I imagine. What I'm going to do today, and I'll speak for about 20 minutes, I think, is to offer some rather general reflections on our field of phenomenological psychopathology in its relationship to philosophy and other fields, and I hope that will be appropriate for this centenary event. Can you see me okay now? Because I have my text in front of me. I trust this is good?
Yes, it is good.
Okay, so The Heart of the Matter is my title, on phenomenological psychopathology. So if we define philosophy simply as love of knowledge, then it's obviously a requirement for any serious scientific, scholarly, or professional pursuit in whatever field. Philosophy's relevance is also wide-ranging and even universal when we define it as the most basic or general discipline, the discipline that poses foundational questions regarding the nature and the legitimacy of knowledge itself. Philosophy does seem, however, to have special pertinence or relevance for the human sciences, and perhaps especially for the mental health-related disciplines. Fields like psychiatry and clinical psychology often seem to run the risk of degenerating into one or another form of what one philosopher of science called a degenerating research program, whether this takes the form of reductionism, rigidification, or mere banality. This, at least, was the view of Karl Jaspers, whose crucial book, The General Psychopathology, first appeared in 1913. As Karl Jaspers put it, quoting, "To sum up, if anyone thinks he can exclude philosophy and leave it aside as useless, he will eventually be defeated by it in some obscure form or other," end quote. Now, Karl Jaspers' opinion here has been shared by many thoughtful psychiatrists and psychologists and other mental health professionals ever since. Though Jaspers recognized that what he called, quote, "the correctness of scientific insights in general and in psychiatry is not proved by philosophy," end quote, he insisted that philosophy's exclusion could, in his opinion, only be disastrous for psychiatry. In his opinion, not only was philosophy needed to distinguish the different modes of knowing in the necessarily diverse disciplines concerned with psychopathology, it was also required in order to clarify methods and to organize our otherwise unruly knowledge into a comprehensive and coherent whole. Philosophy was, in Jaspers' opinion, also necessary in order to provide what he called a general illumination of existence. That is to say, of the dilemmas that the human condition poses for all of us. In order to understand the field of play within which a patient and her symptoms exist, and also to allow the doctor or therapist to achieve the self-illumination, as he called it, required for true empathy and understanding. Philosophy, quoting now from Jaspers, therefore creates the space for all the operations of our knowledge, end quote. The often nebulous, contestable, and decisively experiential nature of mental or emotional problems render philosophy indispensable to research, theory, and practice in the mental health professions. Now, Jaspers, as we all know, was an exceptionally broad thinker, with an ability both to appreciate and to criticize a wide variety of perspectives. He did, however, have a special respect and predilection for the phenomenological, existential, and hermeneutic traditions in Western thought. As he recognized, thinkers like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche had offered valuable illuminations of the enigmas of freedom, death, and anxiety, while the phenomenology inspired by Edmund Husserl allowed for exploring the experiential dimensions of space, time, the self, and the overall sense or feeling of reality. All this suggested both the possibility and the need to consider these existential dilemmas, and also these phenomenological horizons, as they are expressed in various kinds of mental or emotional disorders studied in the field of psychopathology. Now, as we also know, phenomenological psychopathology begins with the work of a number of German, Swiss, and French psychiatrists, namely Karl Jaspers and his pupil Kurt Schneider, also, of course, Ludwig Binswanger and Eugene Minkowski, as well as such figures as von Gebsadel and Erwin Strauss. Key figures of a later generation would certainly include Wolfgang Blankenburg, the Japanese but German-educated psychiatrist Kimura Bin, and the Scottish psychiatrist R.D. Laing. A particularly important event was the meeting 100 years ago in Zurich that brought together Eugene Minkowski with Binswanger, thereby uniting the two most influential traditions of phenomenology and phenomenological psychopathology, which are the French and the German traditions. Now, the phenomenological approach to mental or emotional disorder has been applied to many different conditions, including depression, mania, paranoia, obsessive-compulsive disorder, eating disorders, borderline personality, and others, and also to schizophrenia, which is the form of psychopathology that historically has garnered the most attention in the field. Schizophrenia itself has been of special interest because of its severity, but also because of the seemingly bizarre or even incomprehensible nature of its most characteristic forms of experience and expression, which pose perhaps the greatest challenge to empathic understanding by other individuals. Now, the psychiatrists and psychologists of this tradition were influenced by the philosophers who, at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, focused directly on the study of subjectivity. We might say, however, that this interest in human subjectivity, or at least in subjectivity of a certain kind, seems to have achieved its first, some might even say its noblest, Western apotheosis in the Renaissance works of those near contemporaries, Shakespeare and Rembrandt, and by others of their ilk, whose invention of the human, as it's been called, could be discussed. But full exploration of this dimension was deflected and somewhat delayed by the rationalist and objectivist spirit of the Enlightenment. The most crucial figures of the later 19th and early 20th centuries include Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, as well as Dilthey, William James, and Bergson. They, in turn, together with some predecessors, engender the sometimes parallel, sometimes overlapping traditions of phenomenology, hermeneutics, and existentialism, culminating in the 20th century quartet of Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and Sartre, writers whose themes are the lived world, the lived body, and the varieties and vicissitudes of self-awareness. This orientation toward subjectivity is evident, however, not only in philosophy, but also in the broader realms of art and culture, especially in those modern works, or modernist works, from the late 19th and early 20th centuries that precede and then accompanied the development of phenomenology. That is to say, in 1,000 works of the literary and artistic avant-gardes, in which consciousness or its surrogates, whether in language or in paint, is allowed to thicken and draw attention to itself. And this surely was what Merleau-Ponty had in mind when he wrote that, quote, phenomenology was a movement before becoming a doctrine or a philosophical system, end quote. Going on, then he did, to liken phenomenology to the works of Proust, Valéry, and Cézanne. In such works, the ambition is to go beyond contemplation of even the most luminous face, to pass right through that surface membrane, no matter how thick, and then turn back to see the world from another within. All of these key philosophers were acutely aware of the enigmatic nature of human experience and of the need in studying it to go beyond the limitations and assumptions inherent in both objectivism and also in the standard common sense explanations of human action. The study of subjectivity, of human consciousness, or experiential life, has in fact long been recognized as being fraught with intellectual challenge. Our conscious living is that which is most directly present to us, yet its very nature often seems to evade standard forms of conceptual understanding and to elude our ongoing existential grasp. Most of our familiar concepts and categories have been honed through investigations of the objective or material world. So these concepts and categories often falter or fail when we turn them back onto our own subjectivity or selfhood. And this perhaps is part of what motivated the pre-Socratic poet-philosopher Heraclitus to issue his famous utterance, quote, "You will never find the boundaries of the soul, even if you follow every road, so deep is its measure." Now, Heraclitus wrote in the 6th and early 5th century BC. In the mid-20th century, the phenomenological philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty expressed a similar sentiment by describing conscious awareness as what he called the flaw in the great diamond of the universe. He was actually borrowing an image from the poet Paul Valéry. What Merleau-Ponty meant, I think, is that consciousness is the foundation of any knowledge we may have. It is that by which the world of space, time, and causality comes to exist for us. Yet consciousness is itself quite indescribable in any third-person terms. It cannot be fitted into any objectivist picture of the world. Given these challenges, it is not difficult to understand why many researchers in psychiatry and clinical psychology have succumbed to various forms of objectivism, attempting to evade the enigmas of consciousness by eliminating any reference to subjectivity or the first-person perspective in their account of psychopathology. In their aversion to subjectivity, many such theorists have gone to the extreme of denying or dismissing either the availability or the relevance, sometimes even the very reality of experiential life. Consciousness for them simply disappears as a serious subject of investigation. The most obvious illustration of the challenge or incommensurability posed by the flaw in the great diamond is the so-called hard problem of consciousness. The apparent impossibility for us human beings, at least, of understanding just how the gray matter of the brain could possibly give rise to what's been called the purple haze of consciousness in all its ephemeral and irreducible glory. But even without attempting to integrate mind and brain into an overall explanatory account, consciousness by itself introduces another difficulty. This concerns the problem of how to go about describing the plane of subjectivity, given that its ever-changing, all-encompassing, and elusive qualities are not easily couched either in a physicalist vocabulary or in the everyday language of persons, things, and events. How can experience itself, including such issues as the felt passing of time, background awareness of one's body or spatial horizons, or the way in which the sense of selfhood may wax or wane, how can these be captured in a manner that is both reliable and accurate, or at least not too misleading? And how, in turn, might we understand the sometimes striking, sometimes subtle alterations of these experiences that seem typically to occur in such conditions as schizophrenia, mania, paranoia, depression, or post-traumatic stress disorder? Perhaps the most basic issue, then, involves the challenge of observing and describing conscious life itself, whose ever-changing, all-encompassing flow we as human beings and language speakers are constantly tempted to misperceive or misdescribe. We succumb to this temptation, as William James reminded us, by using words that stress the substantive over the transitory aspects of experience, or by focusing on particular objects of awareness while ignoring subtle alterations in, for example, the overall experience of space, of time, or the atmosphere of reality. In fact, no approach can be fully bottom-up in the sense of being purely empirical or atheoretical. When it comes to describing experiences, patients as well as professionals are burdened, though also blessed, with the objectifying prejudices of their language and their worldview. The study of lived experience may then be impossible as a foolproof quasi-empiricist venture. It is, however, also indispensable, and to both the ethical and the scientific enterprise of psychiatry. A crucial lesson concerns then the element of ineffability, or at least the threat of ineffability, and perhaps unknowability that is lodged at the heart of subjectivity. As Nietzsche pointed out in his words, "We knowers are unknown to ourselves," end quote. This means that any overcoming of our unknowing, of our auto-unknowing, will require some active looking beyond the obvious. For as Nietzsche also insisted, sorry for the call going on in the background. For as Nietzsche also insisted, how can we ever hope to find what we have never looked for? And here, a familiarity with the findings of phenomenological philosophy and psychology must play a crucial role, because it can tell us the sorts of things we need to look for. In his 1912 article, which has already been mentioned in this conference, The Phenomenological Approach in Psychopathology, which is a founding text of our field, Karl Jaspers states that the point of the phenomenological approach is, quote, to further enrich our knowledge of what the psychiatric patient really experiences, end quote. Pursuing such enrichment does seem a valuable, even an indispensable enterprise, given its obvious relevance on several fronts. On a practical level, it seems natural to assume that a richer and more accurate understanding of a patient's experience would make valuable contribution to the planning and the conduct of psychological treatments. At the very least, a professional's ability to empathize with and understand and acknowledge and validate the nature of the patient's experience will help forge a stronger therapeutic alliance, which refers to the patient's overall sense of being well cared for and understood. It seems likely as well that a better understanding of subjective life in these realms might contribute something to our overall understanding of human existence in general. Given that even aspects of so-called normal experience can better be understood in light of the extreme states or limit conditions that can occur in various forms of psychopathology. Still another motive for this pursuit of phenomenological psychopathology, concerns the very definition and delineation of most psychiatric disorders. For it is doubtful that the phenomena of mental and emotional disorder could even be identified apart from recognizing the nature of the experiences suffered by the patients in question. Karl Jaspers criticizes materialism or reductive physicalism, the position of those who are drawn in exclusionary fashion to studying only what Jaspers calls the supposed extra-conscious base on which psychic events may seem to float like a thin layer of foam on the surface of the sea, end quote. While acknowledging the appeal of focusing on the physical plane, Jaspers insists that phenomenology is actually a prerequisite for any such investigation, even of the physical plane. This, he writes, is because it is, quote, only in the setting of these phenomenologically established forms that actual life unfolds itself. And it is, after all, in order to arrive at a better comprehension of this psychic life that we are prompted to investigate its extra-conscious relations, end quote. Here, Jaspers, together with virtually all philosophers and mental health experts in the phenomenological tradition, would agree with contemporary analytic philosophers who view subjectivity or experience as, quote, an explanandum, that is something to be explained in its own right, or who argue that without some idea of what the subjective character of experience is, we cannot know what is required of physicalistic theory. I'm quoting or paraphrasing David Chalmers and Thomas Nagel there. It seems we must, at the very least, articulate the nature of the explanandum. And this means that the study of subjectivity, phenomenology, is indispensable even for the project of naturalizing consciousness or the mind. Now, the science of psychiatry in general, mainstream psychiatry, has been in something of a crisis in the last couple of decades. And there's widespread recognition of stagnating progress in the field, especially regarding the most serious forms of mental disorder, as Thomas Insel famously acknowledged about 10 years ago. Perhaps the most promising potential new direction involves attempts to incorporate more sophisticated ways of understanding the experiential dimensions of the various conditions being studied. This, in turn, requires returning to the rich phenomenological tradition that began over 100 years ago, largely in Heidelberg, Germany, that flourished in mid-20th century Europe, and that is now undergoing a major renaissance in various countries, especially in Europe and South America. We see then that there are very good reasons for locating the study of subjectivity, and in particular, we see then that there are very good reasons for locating the study of subjectivity, and particularly the study of what it is like to suffer from emotional or mental disorder, at the very heart of the discipline of psychopathology, especially of phenomenological psychopathology, which in turn is the field that constitutes, or should constitute, the theoretical core of both psychiatry and clinical psychology. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Luis. It was a great discussion on the matter. When I first read about your title, I was very impressed. I was thinking about the heart of the matter, and it gives me food for thought. I'll think about it in a while. So I don't. Now we have a little time for Q&A. I think we're on a clock, but we have a message from NeuroArts, actually for Professor Luis Sass, but it's just a commenting about how fascinating was your talk.
Thank you.
I don't see another one. Well, I'll say one thing. So, from the point of view all, uh, what would you think it's more interesting for the future of phenomenology, especially thinking on the students. I myself, even I study phenomenology on the philosophy perspective. In a while, I only touched the psychopathology aspects of phenomenology 2 years ago. So I'm studying a lot, but I feel there is so much to go on. What are your thoughts on that?
On which aspects of phenomenology beyond psychopathology to study?
On psychopathology for our students, for us, and
May I?
Please.
Yes, I think Fabio means that the reach of philosophical phenomenology has been more relevant than the reach of psychopathology for people qualifying training in clinical psychology and psychiatry. I think something like that, isn't Fabio?
yeah, here in Brazil, we tend to push the philosophical aspect too much sometimes.
You mean there's too much attention paid to the philosophers and not to the psychologists and psychiatrists who've applied?
Yes, yes. I don't think it's a problem. I don't think it's a problem at all. But
Yeah.
sometimes we put too much attention on that, and we don't look at the psychiatrists and psychologists and all.
Well, I mean, I don't have anything that isn't obvious to say in a way, but I mean, some combination of looking at the classical writings, which are anthologized in a couple of places, including the Maudsley Reader that Matthew and others edited. Also, the wonderful book by Cutting and Shepard, the Clinical Roots of the Schizophrenia Concept, I think is the title, which is more narrowly on schizophrenia, but is full of very valuable things. And those, for a person who's starting out, those two collections would be a great beginning. And I think they have quite a few articles that illustrate the way in which both philosophical ideas are of clinical and at least psychopathological relevance, you know, with articles by people like Minkowski and Blankenburg. So I'm not sure that that's, and then of course the more contemporary things written by people here on this, in this panel, but also others like Thomas Fuchs and Matthew Ratcliffe and Joseph Parnas and many other somewhat younger people who are turning out very important work. Is that an answer to your question, or maybe I'm not?
No, yes, it is. It is.
Okay.
I think that's a power message for all the students, my students, in the graduation of psychology, and all my colleagues here in Brazil, and I think all around the world.
I would say one more thing, a book that both Matthew and I, and I'm sure everyone knows, but The Divided Self by R.D. Laing, for a lot of people, including me, was an absolutely crucial book to have read when I was young. And so it's so brilliantly written, and one can criticize it in various ways like everything, but it's really, I think because it's often good to immerse yourself a little bit more deeply than just an article in a particular perspective. And that's both a book that's both, has a kind of classic status, but is also very readable. And I don't know if you agree with that, Matthew. Probably you do.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of it, Louis. It had a big influence on me as a medical student, and one I still buy for most of my psychiatry trainees because it's still incredible. I think the current edition in the UK has an introduction by Tony David, who, of course, is a very influential researcher himself and a neuropsychiatrist. So, yeah, I think I have a lot of respect for the young Lang, Louis, and his work. It's incredible. And the chap could, read German, had internalized Hegel and Binswanger at a young age. Yeah, incredible views, I think. Well, we're going to make a follow-up to Louis' point, if that's okay, Fabio. I mean, one of the things that I try to get a bit across in my talk is just that kind of feeling for clinicians to realize that phenomenology is really important for the future of our subject. So it's not historical, it's a genuine source of new knowledge. And the point that Louis made about, we're not doing the best we can for our patients. There is a kind of therapeutic impasse sometimes. We need to really rethink about the importance of self-experience to reinvigorate our science and clinical practice. So it's a really crucial, important problem for us. And I guess one of the things I'm also interested in how we can try and get more wide-stream academia to get interested and excited again through working with journals, with funders, thinking how we connect things like, RCTs and more standard ways of doing research with phenomenology. So I think there's a challenge of how we upscale some of these techniques and knowledges. But, it's fantastic. There's things like EASE training courses, for example, and the UE that Louis and Giovanni wrote. So it's really great. We've got these more standardized tools now coming into the field.
Thank you. Thank you all. Before we end the session, someone of you would want to share some last words for our meeting before I start to finish it?
Guilherme. Well, I would only to thank you all, to congratulate you all, congratulate you for offering us some of your Friday. And Louis, I know this Thanksgiving Day in the US, so
it's the day after. Yeah.
The day after.
Yeah.
So,
part of the same thing, but it's a pleasure.
Thanksgiving shadow. So,
yeah.
So thank you for your effort. I really would appreciate if we could meet soon and keep meeting under the umbrella of many initiatives like Matteo and Giovanni's initiative funded by Wellcome Trust, so that we can get bigger and bigger and strengthen this perspective throughout the years to come. And thank you for for Ashok for chairing from Oxford, Fabio, Flavio, Mihir, and all the audience as well.
I would just like to say that also that I think to a lot of young people whom I've spoken to, and this was also true for me when I was young and beginning, phenomenology sort of offers a way of, bringing things together in a way that makes human sense, but also scientific sense. And I think a lot of people go into our field, clinical psychology or psychiatry or psychiatric social work, because they're really interested in, the nature of human existence. And then they encounter a field which is sort of, has some useful ideas, but it's all very fragmented and doesn't give you any theoretical way of bringing things together and thinking about either experience or the challenges that that limit situations pose for human beings, and so I think that this is the approach which that was Jasper's view. I mean, he was very frustrated when he started writing the General Psychopathology, well over 100 years ago, by the disorganized kind of randomness of knowledge in psychiatry, and so he tried to bring it together. And I think we're still faced with that challenge. And phenomenology is one of the best ways of addressing that.
May I say a couple of words? Well, as I wrote in the chat, I'm really proud to be part of this community. And I would like to invite young people listening to us to join us, because this community is an open community.
Mhm.
So don't hesitate.
We'll try.
That.
Well, anyone else? So
I just thank you to those of you who organized it. I'm not sure whether I'm even aware of all the people who did, but obviously Fabio, Guilherme, Ashok, and whoever else had the idea of making this event happen.
Well, maybe I could have the last word in that case, which is to say that I really cannot take credit for this. That this has been driven by Guilherme's passion to make sure this centenary celebration happened, and actually the hard work's really been done by Flavio and Fabio and Mihir. So really exciting that this younger generation have really involved in this, and I'd echo your words and Giovanni's that it's an open community, and younger people, if I'm allowed to call you that, Matthew, because you are the future, but also Fabio and Flavio. So I really hope that in the audience, people will say, well, these are certainly what I've heard today, giants of this area. And Louis, for you and Giovanni and Guilherme and Matthew, it's been sensationally educational, particularly for a humble surgeon like me who doesn't get the opportunity to spend this kind of time with the philosophers and psychiatrists. So thank you very much. Many congratulations on the celebration. And I look forward to us meeting at some point in person. Thank you all.
thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thanks all the audience to join us on our celebration event. Special thanks for our speakers of today, Professors Guilherme, Giovanni, Matthew, and Luis. Once again, I want to emphasize the thanks for the kind Professor Ashok and me here, all the values-based centered, and for Dr. Daniela Seron Litvok, the president of Brazilian Society of Phenomenological Psychopathology, Dr. Flávio Guilherme Guimarães Fernandes, Dr. Gustavo Bonini, and Dr. Felipe Arruda. Thank you all.
Okay.